coming up.
We did make the transition from coal to gas. There was a lot of effort done to make sure that that happened. But then the government and other groups start moving the goalposts. So therefore, now we have to get rid of gas.
Okay. So is net zero by 2035, is that a realistic goal?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
First, I'd like to talk to Ms. Collins with Canada West. There was a discussion, as what you had indicated, resource determination, diverse electricity landscape. These are provincial regulations, provincial resources, and we of course have the issue of federal government encroaching in that area. So you had talked about some of the things that had happened as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. I wonder if you could start off with that, and then I'll have some other questions.
Certainly, thank you.
Ms. Collins, can you turn your camera on, please, for interpretation? Yes. Or there you go. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. You know, my point is that you have to start from the point of the constitutional positions of the role of electricity in this country being provincial jurisdiction. Unless we're prepared to change the Constitution here, and I think we might have other areas where we might start, we start there.
Ms. Collins.
The second thing is that
Ms. Collins, sorry, we're having challenges with your connection. Interpreters are having a hard time being able to interpret with the breakup. So I pause your time, Mr. Dreeshen. So what we will do is, if you could provide a brief, you're able to provide a brief to the committee on anything that you may have missed today, and so we can continue on with the meeting. So I'm going to go back to Mr. Dreeshen. Mr. Dreeshen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And perhaps I'll direct this question to Ms. Joseph. We did make the transition from coal to gas. There was a lot of effort done to make sure that that happened. But then the government and other groups start moving the goalposts. So therefore, now we have to get rid of gas. We have to go back into these other areas. And you talked about, the need for four more Site C dams if we wish to come anywhere close. I don't imagine building dams in Canada is any more easy to get through the folks than building more gas plants. So I think that's one of the problems. And of course, if you also look at the doubling of the and tripling of the infrastructure that is required, we're talking right now about how you can transfer it across provinces and how you can get the energy from one spot to the other. But then you are also talking about how are you going to get it into communities, how are you going to get it into homes, and we've heard people talk about doubling or tripling the cost that would be required to make that happen. So then the big question becomes, who pays? So right now we demonize big oil. So eventually it will be big wind and it'll be big sun because there will be billions of dollars being made in that industry. So they're going to be the ones that are paying. They're also going to be the ones that are going to be filling their pockets with a lot of money from this. So I wonder if you could just kind of talk about how we can transition through this in a logical fashion so that we can assist in getting electrification to where it needs to be, but stop this demonizing of what we have. And the only way that you'll ever get things to happen is if you cut out oil and gas.
Thank you. So I would echo the comments made by Ms. Collins around really trying to respect and let the provinces lead in terms of the approach to transforming electricity systems, because they have the strongest sense of where they're starting from and what some of the local lessons learned have been. I think that, when I hear we have to electrify everything as soon as possible, there's a real risk of asymmetry between the load going up and the supply not being available to meet it. And at the end of the day, and I'll give the example of Hydro-Quebec, they've announced plans to spend between $152 and $185 billion to enhance their electricity system. somebody has to pay for that. And you multiply that across the country, and it's very significant. And again, for the current needs we have and the current end use we have, we don't have enough electricity. So we need to start building more, absorbing those costs, and taking further steps.
One of the other things you had also spoken of is the stationary end use that is required. And so this is where where you generally have an industry that is compact, and it's easy then to move that energy around. So one of the options, of course, is small modular reactors, and there again you're going to find the same group of people that don't like anything else that are also going to be against that. So so that again becomes one of the issues. But when you think that we need to have industry. That's the thing that is going to pay for all of these things. So there has to be a balance. How do you think that governments can look at that balance? Somewhere along the line, you have to simply say to those that don't want to see any development that's other than, and I'm curious as to how they think it's going to work, but how that is going to come to fruition.
Yeah, I think, the CER estimates we need to get from 152 gigawatts of capacity to 350 gigawatts. So this is massive, massive. And again, if we are not able to manage how those costs pour out to either the ratepayer or the taxpayer, we're going to have serious competitiveness issues because those things have to be paid for, assuming we have the labor, et cetera. So I think, sequencing these things and having them locally driven, allowing the provinces to work with industry, with, communities, mayors, municipalities on how to pace things, I think it's going to be vitally important.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to point to a report that came out in February of 2023, Renewable Powerhouse title, as new research finds the wind and solar power with battery storage is set to produce cheaper electricity than natural gas in Alberta and Ontario. And I think, Mr. Pivnik, you briefly touched in your opening remarks about the potential. Currently, it's cheaper, but it's going to go further down. Can you quickly touch on that?
This report came about because when we look right around the world, wind and solar is by far the cheapest way that you can generate electricity today. So our premise was, how can we maximize that role? And that starts with understanding what those costs are here in Canada. Right now, we're heavily reliant on studies out of the US to tell us what are those capital costs, what are those operating costs. So we went in this study looking at Ontario, looking at Alberta, where we have seen significant renewable development. We went in and said, let's go talk to companies, let's look at the research, and let's build Canadian-based cost estimates for what this costs us so that we can have an informed conversation about how we can get renewables to be as much of a role as they will be. Most studies point in a net zero Canada, 30 to 40% could be coming from renewables. How do we ensure we're able to achieve that? How do we ensure we can maximize the role of the cheapest way we can generate electricity, especially if others have pointed out that we've got a very significant build out to occur in a short period of time?
Yeah, so 30 to 40% is going to come renewable, and leading renewable naturally is solar and wind. And what is the pricing? How do you see the price compared to, let's say, for gas?
Yeah, I think in every single jurisdiction, you're going to have slightly different prices. Right now, you're looking at wind and solar being able to come somewhere between 5 and 10 cents a kilowatt hour. When you look at natural gas, again, probably up into, certain natural gas at times can be around the same price or upwards above 10 cents into 15 cents. When we look at this full picture, though, we're talking about needing the full suite of options available to us. Renewables are where we need to start and to think about from how do we maximize the cheapest available, and then look at how do we address the other pieces, because reliability, security, this is the only way this build out is going to work.
So, Madam Shannon, Joseph talked about the way I understood that we need to look at gas as a bridge until we figure out many other things, including skills, including having the right skill set, having the right investment, having the right model of being able to finance all of this thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry.
I'm asking. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question again?
Madam Shannon, you want to answer that?
Okay. Well, I think that there are reports that have come out. Basically, the infrastructure you don't have to build is free, and we have a lot of infrastructure that can be leveraged in terms of the gas infrastructure, into which you could blend hydrogen and other things. But at least you have something delivering while you're building up what needs to be lots of additional capacity on the electricity side. And if you can use this while you do something else, it lowers the cost because you didn't have to build something else. That's what I mean.
So to me, that's a bridging.
Sure.
Correct. That's a bridging and looking. Okay, there's an aspect of that at some point, once you build that capacity, there needs to be decommissioning, and then you're left with a certain asset. What are your thoughts on that one?
As long as you can deliver on your energy fundamentals, sure. Right? Like we can, those systems will be decommissioned when the new system can deliver what it's supposed to. And there's a long road there. As I said, it's like the CER's at 130% increase in our electricity. We're just starting.
So you're suggesting the timing would be such as when we are starting commissioning, then we are sunsetting some of the others. The
sequencing of that will be determined by the utilities who are responsible for safety.
Going back to Clean Energy Canada, you had I believe you had 4 recommendations in your report. And I'd like to actually focus on the second recommendation, which specifically says send the right signal and create policy certainty. And I want to touch about policy certainty and get your point of view. And I think Dr. Collins also touched about the need for policy certainty. Can you share what you mean by policy certainty, and what can we do specifically as a recommendation? Think about this. At the end of this report, we're going to put a recommendation, and one of those recommendations has to be policy certainty. And how would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainty when it comes to this, and especially with the scale of investment we're talking about, is absolutely essential. And that's everything from the investment and fiscal instruments the federal government uses to the regulations it sends. So clear, proactive publication of those when it comes to ITCs, making sure the rules are clear, that everyone knows exactly what's required in order to make sure capital can move. When it comes to pollution regulations, making sure that the details are clear, that they've been well developed, that they're flexible to meet jurisdictions, but that more than anything else, we're clear about where we're going. And the clearest one from a signal perspective is what we see from provinces. We have almost every province in the country has set net zero as a clear target. That provides an anchor for where we're needing to go, and that certainty is essential.
Electricity Canada warning about catastrophic conditions if we fixed up our electricity regulations and pushed to get to cleaner energy. They were predicting brownouts and disasters, and God, my friend Earl's talking about the dangers of big sun. Mr. Thomas, you accused them of a misinformation campaign. That's a pretty bold language, and you said it's disappointing to see an industry association like Electricity Canada employ such misleading rhetoric because its fossil fuel powered members are delaying the transition to clean energy. What do you mean by that?
Thank you. It's disappointing to see an industry association show up in that way in a conversation about where things are headed in Canada on our electricity future. And more confusing for me because Electricity Canada as an entity has so many members who themselves are already entirely clean electricity providers or have committed themselves to produce clean electricity by 2035 or another date. So if I were those members of that association, I would be embarrassed. When it comes to the kind of misinformation or inflammatory language that we see in their ad campaign, it's more along that language of blackouts and brownouts and cost, and we just don't know what numbers they're using to make those claims. When it comes to the clean electricity regulations, when it comes to the research that we've been a part of, we see that as we move to a cleaner electricity system, we move to a cheaper electricity system, and the cost of energy on the whole for households goes down as we electrify, and as we move to clean electricity too.
Well, thank you. Because one of the things that really shocked me, I mean, Ontario used to be a hydro superpower. I mean, of course, Kathleen Wynne helped to sell off, and Doug Ford nailed it into the ground. But Ontario is now complaining that if we bring in clean electricity regulations, it'll be a catastrophe for them, and they need until 2050 in order to meet this. That seems to be staggeringly lazy, given what I'm seeing all over the world. We've seen a huge revolution in clean tech, Texas, California, all over Europe, and yet Ontario saying, don't give us any rules that make us actually improve. What is it that we have such dismal standards? Do you think that it's realistic to say to an energy superpower like Ontario, don't bother cleaning up until 2050?
So at the David Suzuki Foundation, our research tells us and informs our view that moving to clean electricity is good for the places that do that work. That's true for Ontario. That's true for everywhere in Canada. It's true that different provinces have different levels of work to do. We have different starting points, and I think that too is where the federal government can help with provinces on their varying pathways to this clean electricity target and this clean electricity future. It was great and encouraging for us to see that the federal government and the government of Nova Scotia reached a common understanding on the clean electricity regulations. That too is a province that depends an awful lot on coal, and sees the value in cleaning up its electricity system. So in Ontario and elsewhere, we see the value.
We could do better. I mean, certainly if our Liberal government ever got their investment tax credits out of whatever department they're hiding in, we would certainly see a huge revolution. We haven't seen anything yet. Mr. Pivnik, I wanted to ask you because, you don't often get to see an economic revolution happening before your face. But within the last year, we've seen staggering increases in EV battery storage capacity, solar capacity. We've seen countries go from 0 to 100 in staggering times. Again, jurisdictions like California now going many days just on clean energy. Texas, where they got less people who believe in climate change than the Conservative caucus, are doing that. How do you see the potential for Canada? Like, are we going to sit on the sidelines while the rest of the world moves ahead, while Europe moves ahead? What is the potential here in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's entirely up to the choices governments, both provincial and certainly the federal government, makes around the level of ambition we put on this. We keep talking about costs with net zero, and there's no question that doubling our grid in 25 years to achieve net zero is a cost or has a cost associated with it, but it's also should be viewed as an opportunity for Canada to choose to be competitive in a world that's trying to achieve net zero. And when you look across the world, you've got nearly 150 countries covering 90% of global CO2 emissions that have lined up to achieve that target as well, and they're accelerating. So the choice for Canada is, do we want to be part of that? Do we want to try and secure the investments from that? We've seen some of those coming and landing with some of the choices that we've made in the battery supply chain. There's incredible opportunities right across the country. Alberta's got to have one of the best opportunities to be a player in this of any jurisdiction.
Just to end, I mean, we were born on third base when it comes to energy potential. And now we're saying, oh, it's going to be too hard to get to 2050. Oh, my God, give us a break. While the rest of the world that doesn't have nearly what we have are going there. So what does it say? I mean, we started out with 85% clean grid. To get to that other 15% shouldn't be that difficult. Can we do it?
Yeah, I absolutely think we can, and I think the Clean Electricity Advisory Council made it clear that we have to tackle two challenges at the same time. The first is that decarbonization of the remaining 15%, as you said. The second is to double, and the choices we make in the investments and how we look to do that is the other part of that equation.
Thank you.
Ms. Joseph, I'll start with you. It was mentioned earlier that the cost of wind and solar is 5 to 10 cents, gas 10 to 15 cents. Is that per kilowatt or kilowatt hour? What would that be?
You know, I was impressed by the numbers some of the colleagues spoke to. I guess, what I think is important is a lot of times those numbers don't include the full cost of transmission for energy, which is going to be very distributed. It doesn't include the cost of storage. It doesn't include the cost of dispatchable power. We spoke earlier about those utilities and why are they, saying all these mean things. Today, a lot of the renewables in Alberta are backed up by dispatchable gas plants, and they sit idle. And when they come on, it's a premium cost. And I don't know that there are batteries much cheaper than that, but the point is, I don't know that this is cheap, and we shouldn't discuss it as if it's cheap. There's a lot of things to build. There's a lot of things that don't exist yet.
What is the cheapest form of energy to produce?
Right now, the cheapest electricity is natural gas, but maybe it's hydro. I don't want to get into necessarily the competition. I think different energy sources are affordable in different applications, and we have to use what's best to achieve all of our goals, including our environmental goals. So, in Quebec, it might be very cheap to do hydro in other places, but every new thing you build has to be paid for, and we have to build a lot of new things.
From a capital cost perspective, there's a lot of infrastructure that's needed if we're going to keep up with the demand that we're looking at. From a capital cost investment, which is the cheapest form of energy to produce from just a capital cost, not operational?
I don't have that number, and I don't want to speculate on it. I think it matters where you are.
Okay. This committee did a study probably 6 years ago on electrical interties, and it was determined that even provincially our systems aren't compatible. Have you seen any progress in that respect over the last couple of years?
Well, there are provinces that share electricity today, and Quebec and Newfoundland are an example. Quebec and Ontario are an example. So there are some interties. It's not a huge amount of energy that's shared between them. And again, most provinces don't have enough electricity now. So building a bunch of interties doesn't solve the problem that you don't have the generation. Because again, we're talking about expanding what electricity does in a way that's never happened before.
When you look at all our potential power sources for electricity that exist today, how much capacity do we have that's available, including stuff that's parked?
What the capacity that's available in terms of new build is not close to 350 gigawatts. Like, it's not close to what we're really talking about in terms of what we would need to build.
The former CEO of Manitoba Hydro says that it would take about 20 years to get a new dam from conception to producing electricity. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, I would agree with anyone who runs a utility if they tell me how long things take to make.
Okay. And when we look at renewables going forward, can you talk a little bit about reliability and storage?
I mean, today, again, natural gas plays a really important role in wind integration and renewables integration in terms of ensuring grid stability. And, the Canadian Electricity Association had published a report in response to the proposed clean electricity regulations. And they said, we can't ensure reliability, safety, et cetera, without natural gas. And you can't tell us when to get rid of it. We'll get rid of it when it works for us. In Manitoba Hydro put out a pretty detailed study of, moderate to aggressive paths to net zero. In all of them, they need natural gas. And I think we need to be listening to the people whose job it is to provide energy 24/7 to our citizens and ensure safety.
Okay. So is net zero by 2035, is that a realistic goal?
Well, we've never told anyone what the net is on net zero. But what I will say is the CER's numbers to achieve that by 2035, I'm not sure how that could be done without really high burdens of cost to the population and impacts to quality of life and competitiveness.
Okay. And I think probably, 10 seconds. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
We'll now proceed to our next speaker, Mr. Bruson. Go ahead, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I think the conversation is actually pretty interesting because what we're talking about are what the fundamentals are for a clean electrical grid. So, if we're talking about it needs to be clean, it needs to be affordable, it needs to be reliable. And what I'm hearing is people trying to wrestle with those issues. So I thought maybe if I could start with the David Suzuki Foundation. I mean, what essentially I seem to hear from the last bit of evidence from Ms. Joseph is that you can't actually get those three things by 2035 in a net zero scenario. What do you vision when you're thinking about getting to a clean grid? What do we need to do to get there?
Thanks very much. I think the core principle here, we already talked about policy clarity, policy certainty. I think that's one thing that the federal government can provide here.
Do you mind if I interrupt you on that, though?
Sure.
Just to say, what does that look like? Like, if I was actually going to try and get granular, what does that policy certainty look like? Because I'm hearing different things as to what the message should be.
There's a range of things when it comes to funding, actually implementing the ITCs for clean electricity, to the federal government having a very clear policy statement, policy framework for where Canada's headed to grow and clean our electricity system. But it is also regulations. It is a clear policy signal, a clear target, and clear rules in the clean electricity regulations coming out this year. And for us, when we talk about visioning what the grid can look like, we talk a lot about where things are at today, why it's challenging to move forward. But that's the whole point of this work, is looking where the puck is going, not where the puck is today. If I can hazard a hockey quote. So for us, we talk about wind and solar being the cheapest form of electricity in the world and the cheapest form of new power that we can build here in Canada. So maximizing that and creating an electricity framework, electricity systems in provinces that can make the best use of that lowest cost electricity is a priority. And it's also, when it comes to timing, we've also heard a lot in committee today, the long tails, the long timelines that things like large hydro dams or other large bulky electricity systems have. And those things I believe are also true. And that's why wind and solar as modular, shovel-ready projects are also attractive for how quickly we need to build out electricity generation. Wind and solar between 2 and 5 years for a project timeline, depending on the permitting and where things are at. If we're reaching for something that we need to build quickly and need to build cheaply, wind, solar, and energy storage are definitely priorities. And that's another reason why we see energy efficiency and an upgrading of the grid more broadly, specifically the transmission system, as other keystones that enable that low-cost electricity to deliver when it's needed.
I only have 2 minutes left. I'm going to cut
Sure.
you there, and actually, if I can go to Mr. Pavenik then with the same question. I mean, if we're trying to get to an affordable, reliable, and clean grid by 2035, when we're saying policy, or you're saying policy certainty, all that, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I think I'd focus on two specific pieces. So the first one, I completely agree around the ITCs. The idea of the federal government coming in and helping fund this is about ensuring that our progressive tax system can help support the build out of these resources. It will ensure greater equity across the board. It will not be asking the lowest income families to bear the cost of the build out that's required. It will actually be using progressive taxation to do so. ITCs are an incredibly important tool to put into place as quickly as possible. Another specific example would be the SREP program that was spoken to earlier. That could be retooled to focus on demand management more directly. And it can help unlock the distribution level things that at a lowest cost perspective, energy efficiency, distributed resources, this is really a conversation that we're very nascent in and we're very behind in when it comes to Canada. In Ontario with the IESO, they've stood up one of the largest and one of the first pilots of this. They now have the ability to pull the equivalent of Kingston, Ontario off the grid during a peak event. It's 90 megawatts that they can reduce that peak when they are seeing that climb. Those sorts of tools are the ones that we need to be building our grid to optimize if we're really concerned about costs. And I think those are two instruments the federal government should be prioritizing.
2 questions. Certainly one of the things that I find when our friends who come to support the fossil fuel industry and inertia, when they compare what we would use besides natural gas or fossil fuels, they always refer to dams, and we know hydroelectric dams are massive, huge projects. Yet California right now, the largest contributor to the California grid, which has a population the size of Canada, is battery power. The battery revolution is massive, both in Texas and California. Now, California is working to go from 8 gigawatts to 42 gigawatts while we're still sitting here talking about it. So I want to ask you about the position that we, with battery, we can, and wind, we are cheaper than natural gas. I want to ask you that. Secondly, that what I also hear from my conservative-minded colleagues, that this is all provincial jurisdiction and we should let the provinces do whatever they want. but we are a G7 country. We have G7 obligations, and we have signed international commitments. How important is it that we meet those commitments?
Thanks for the question. As I mentioned before, the batteries here in Ontario are significantly less expensive than a new gas plant. The government issued a contract. They want to build a new gas plant in Napanee, and that plant is going to cost $1,680 per megawatt. The battery plants they offered contracts to are going to cost $680 per megawatt. So 40% of the cost. The batteries are significantly less expensive than the gas plants. And Clean Energy Canada did the analysis around this too, that we have wind power paired with batteries. It's going to come in cheaper than gas. And also, we know these prices, they're going to be set for a long time because we're not like dependent on gas, which is a volatile commodity, the price of which goes up and down based on events that are beyond our control and happen outside of this country. To your question around Canada's international obligations and provinces and whether, we know some provinces are not on board with the clean electricity regulations. They're not on board with net zero by 2035. And I think the federal government has an obligation not only to do its part as a G7 country, but as a signatory to the Paris Accord, we have an international obligation to be on track for net zero, to meet with the Prime Minister's commitment to a net zero grid by 2035, to reduce our emissions, and not only to meet the targets that this country has set, but to double down on those targets and to hear the calls to action coming from the UN Secretary General, coming from the International Energy Agency, coming from everybody that's watching that this climate crisis is getting worse and worse by the day. We have to do more, and we need the federal government to really exert its power to work within its authority, its constitutional authority, to get all the provinces in line as well.